Hi, everyone. I am Lindsay Smith, your host for this episode of The Agronomists. And yes, Ray DeBenko, we started on time. I'm turning over a new leaf, maybe. Maybe this will be a trend. I doubt it, so don't get used to it. Okay. Yes, this is The Agronomists. We've got an hour live stream. We're going to be taking all of your questions. I've got a couple clips lined up that I might actually use this week. And of course, as always, watching tonight's show does qualify you for some CEU credits if you do collect them. So you only have 4 weeks to let us know, actually. And not everybody knows that. So please, if you are watching along and you do collect them, please make sure you head over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow when this ends up on the site and let us know so that you can collect those ever important CEUs. Okay, so tonight we have 2 first-time guests for the Agronomists. So look at me, on time and 2 new guests. So look at that. And we're talking about cover crops and soil health. And this is one of those ones, not that long ago, we did a poll on what we hoped people were kind of focused on over the winter, on what they plan to be learning about. And soil health and soil management was number 1 on that list. So without further ado, I will bring in Laura Van Eerd and Scott Gillespie. Laura's based at Ridgetown, Ontario. Scott, you're in the very dry Alberta. I cannot wait to share some of the fantastic images you've got lined up for us. Now, they're fantastic because who doesn't like a challenge? But they're not pretty, let me tell you. So we'll get to that. Okay, so so Jason Vogt is laying down the gauntlet. He says the trifecta is starting on time, getting all the clips in, and ending on time. That's probably not going to happen. So anyway, here we go. All right. Okay. So before we sort of delve into some of the questions and into the clips and these sorts of things, I want from each of you, let's outline sort of what our goals are with cover crops, because there are so many. So I want to sort of collect a few of them so that we can put this conversation in context of what we're trying to do. So Laura, maybe I'll start with you. You, of course, have been working in this space for quite some time. What are maybe the most common goals that producers have using cover crops?
Oh, yeah, you changed the question at the last second. I was all prepared for what's my goal? And then you're like, producers. Okay, so
Yeah.
let me back up and say, so for my goal in my research in the long-term cover crop trial, it's to see the changes over time. And so we want to, we started the trial in 2007. So they've been going on for, 15, almost, 15 years. So at first our goal was about nutrients and maintaining nutrients. And now we're measuring soil health and trying to figure out, how have those cover crops changed soil health? And so that's the goal in my study, long-term study. We have other studies looking at cover crops with different goals. That's where we're coming from.
Okay. And Scott, with the clients you work with the farmers in your area, what are the goals, the number 1 goal or the top few?
To me, the number 1 goal should always be to pay back the farmer somehow. There should be a return on investment, and there should be something. I've kind of come to the conclusion there has to be something come back within a year, maybe 2 years, or within the next season. Like, is the best way to make them work. And so, as an example, in my area, wind erosion is a huge problem, and and so really, holding onto your soil, it really doesn't matter if you hold onto your soil. You've got payback. You've made money. So beyond that, then that's where it can get a little bit trickier as to what exactly you're going to do because of a lot of the limitations. But there should be some type of a payback that you can measure right away.
Okay, I like that. Now, we are going to get into different ways that cover crops are used to achieve some of these goals. Other ones, of course, are, yes, holding soil or slowing down water runoff, fixing nitrogen or cycling nutrients, and holding nutrients, right? I mean, that's a big one in Ontario for sure. Weed suppression would be one of them. I don't know that it's used as commonly as some of those other reasons. But in all these, and it's a great perspective, Scott, to look at, especially with Laura doing long-term trials, and then to think about it in that very short term, whether or not, I think, Scott, and maybe Jay, actually, if we can bring that photo up of the wind erosion. When Scott talks about wind erosion, he's not messing around. So Scott, walk us through just what general area of Alberta this is in. And this is from this year, correct?
Yeah, well, and I don't know whether this all accumulated this year, but this past winter, we had very little snow cover, which isn't uncommon in our area. So the general area is, if people know Southern Alberta, it'd be between the Brooks Tabor area, and so it's south. It'd be southeast of Calgary. So if you know your history, if you know the Palliser Triangle, the area that was considered too barren to settle or to be worth settling, this is the area because we are in the dry area. And so this past winter, we do get these Chinook winds where we have 30 to 50k winds that will blow for days, but sometimes they'll go 50 to 70. This past winter, we had one day that was 70 to 90, and there was a gust that was clocked at 140. So we have winds, and there's still a lot of tillage. And so this fence here caught a lot of sand. So that's the context of this picture here.
Yeah, exactly.
And I do have...
Sorry,
I was going to say, actually, now that I think about it, I do actually have a picture somewhere deep in my library of a fence post sticking out of grass, where I think, so give this a few years and the grass or the weeds will take over, and it doesn't look, you see this funny looking hill in the area, but there's a fence buried in it. So
yeah.
So
happens. And one of the reasons why I want to sort of put this in context as well is because Ontario and Western Canada have very different challenges. The challenge in Ontario is we've got, sometimes excessive moisture, especially in the late season. So sometimes it can be a challenge to keep nutrients where we want them or to keep soil where we want them. And then, of course, Western Canada has a shorter growing season often. And in some cases, like this year, no moisture. But there's still a place for cover crops in both, which is really interesting. And we're going to explore that a bit more in the West, and also, of course, explore just what we're learning in the East as well. And yes, Peter, we do have wind erosion in Ontario, and we have tillage erosion, and we have water erosion. We have all the fun erosions here in Ontario. So yes. Also, quick shout out to John, who was a little late. John usually does the introduction tonight, so I'll send him a bill for my services for having had to do the introduction. Anyway, but what I want to do, and Peter Johnson, I'm glad you're in the comments, because I pulled up a video from several years ago that is sort of like, it's not at all the beginning of cover crops in Ontario, but I'm going to say it's sort of the beginning of a lot of momentum for cover crops in Ontario. And I want to watch this one first because I want to use that as a leaping off point of what's changed and what have we learned since then. So Peter, prepare to be amazed by yourself back in the day. Jay, if we could go to that clip. I know it's out of order, so I apologize in advance.
So cover crop crazy. I can't believe the amount of hype about cover crops that is out there in the countryside now. This is the third time in my career, in my span, that we've actually looked at cover crops. And it's unbelievable because I see guys out there chopping stinking corn stalks. Now, what a labor-intensive, fuel-expensive, ridiculous thing to do. It makes no sense whatsoever. At least with a chopping head, the combine's going through the field anyway. But now I got guys out there chopping corn stalks. Meanwhile, these same guys, some of them, are saying, well, maybe I should, broadcast some cereal rye into those corn stalks and try and have a little green cover. Boy, the dichotomy, the ridiculousness of that drives me nuts. Nonetheless, cover crops are cool. And there's no question that the more organic matter, the more roots we can get to grow, the better. Now, we've looked at cover crops in corn a number of times in the past, and I'll be really surprised if it actually works. But what I will say is, gosh, look at this field right here. This is 200 plus bushel corn, and we've got a strip of annual ryegrass as a test plot. I love test plots, and I am astounded at how decent the stand is of that annual ryegrass. I talked to one of our cooperators. The Thames Valley region, the Heartland region, is doing a project on roots not iron. That's exactly what we're calling this. No more tillage. Let's let the roots do it for us. And one of my cooperators has used an annual ryegrass, crimson clover, hairy vetch combination in his corn stalks in plots for 3 years. That's Dave McEachran, at Dear Dave on Twitter. And his answer was, every year I get a yield increase. And Johnson says, how can that be a yield increase? Well, Peter Sikkema did some work on winter wheat looking at weed control. And I need to revisit this because where he planted wheat with edible beans as a weed, even when he didn't control the edible beans, he got more wheat yield, statistically more wheat yield. So what's going on there? Well, I think it's nitrogen transfer. So maybe we can actually increase corn yields. I doubt it, but lots of things to learn. And so I'm really excited about cover crops. Multi-species they talk about. I'm just happy if you do something after your wheat, for crying out loud. Do you need 8 species? Is 3 enough? We simply don't know. But gosh, I really want you to look at the wonderful structure that this annual ryegrass suddenly puts in the soil. This is so much better than the structure where we don't have any of those roots. See how that just crumbles away? And you can look at the root mass that we're getting. Some of these plants have look at the root mass on that annual ryegrass plant. That's incredible. If that isn't doing good for next year's soybean crop, by golly, I don't know what is. Some weed control issues, some herbicide issues, we should talk about those, but have a look at this. This is something that may change agriculture.
I love it. I mean, really. So this is one of the things I love about having a vault of 10 years of video to go back to, is you can watch Peter Johnson's hair go darker, and he had more of it. Anyway, but also, and perhaps most importantly, we can see sort of how far we've come in a cover crop journey in just a few years. So where do we want to start? I wanted, before we lose the question in the comments, I do want to just very quickly go back to that photo of yours, Scott, that with that wind erosion. Peter wants to know if you tested that soil to look at, how much nutrient in there, or what we're losing in that soil.
Yeah, I did. Not that exact one, but I did pick up some soil that had come off of a potato field. I found it in the ditch, and it was 78% sand, 12% clay, and 10% silt. The organic matter was 2.4%, which in our area is high. But what was interesting is the phosphorus was 160 parts per million, and the potassium was 800 parts per million. So huge amounts of nutrients, and actually all the micronutrients were at adequate levels. So that's why I say hold on to your soil. It's just, you lose so much. You might just think it's sand, but there's a lot in there.
It's very similar to what we've seen in Ontario, where they've, like Anne Verhollen has collected soil off of the, that's blown off the field, and very high levels of nutrients, more than you would expect.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So what's moving when we've got wind erosion is not just extra. This is really what you really want to stay in your soil. So it's a significant loss, right? Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit more, Laura, because of course you've got your 15 years of looking at this, and I think there is a question, and I want to get to Ray's question a little bit about the organic matter building, but it's not just organic matter that builds in these systems that we're necessarily gaining some benefit from. So what are some of the things you've learned from your studies to date?
Yeah. So the very first, like in the early years, we were quantifying that we kept nitrogen in the system, right? It wasn't that we could give a nitrogen credit to the corn, which is what Peter was discussing in that video, right? That one-time use of a cover crop, no, you're not going to get that nitrogen credit. If you want a nitrogen credit, then you need to be using red clover, alfalfa, those legume cover crops. But we could measure and quantify, like in the topsoil and in the plants, that we could quantify more nitrogen in the system. So that's good. We're keeping it in the field. And then more recently, we're measuring soil health. We're seeing increases in soil health, 10%, 10 to 17% increases in soil health. And there are different measurements. I'm collaborating.
So hang on, what are some of those measurements? Because because we're talking about organic matter, but there are other things that you're measuring. So what are those other things that you can measure to actually measure health?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so what we measured was respiration, so how much carbon dioxide evolved off of the field. We measured microbial biomass, so microbial carbon and nitrogen. And then we did protein, we did active carbon. We like 30 different tests, in addition to like pH and micronutrients, macronutrients. And it wasn't all of it always significant, but always the no cover crop was the lowest. And with the cover crop, was higher or statistically higher.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay, so now and you've got some really great slides we're going to share too about bringing it right down to yield, because I mean, even as we started this conversation, Gord, of that value, I think you can make the argument that saving topsoil right there pays its way, but how do you quantify that if you don't always, you're not running down the ditch and picking up that snert and putting it back on and weighing it. So we can't necessarily do that. But one of the questions, and it's coming up in the comments as well, and this is one of the things that we did tackle in a Pulse School this season, which we may or may not get to that clip. But Gord, I'll ask you one of the questions, and it happens in Ontario as well. When moisture is limiting, how do you make the case for growing something else when that could take away from next year's crop?
Are you going first, or are you going first?
Because it's in both provinces that this can happen, right? That we end up in a dry scenario. So Scott, though, I'll start with you, because this is something that, I mean, you're looking at significantly.
Yeah. So, I mean, under irrigated practices, as long as you're not being restricted on water, there really shouldn't be any reason why you're not doing a cover crop, or at least for moisture purposes. In the dry land, like, just to put it in context, I think essentially we've got about 3 inches of rain since April, like our entire growing season. The official numbers are a little higher, but it counts every little, eighth of an inch or quarter inch. But if that comes down and then it just evaporates off, it doesn't really count. So in this case, no, there's no. There's a lot of places didn't even grow a crop, so there's no point in even trying to grow a cover crop. So I think one of the the general rules, or the way to think about it, is if you can run the water through the plant rather than having it just evaporate off and potentially cause salinity issues, then it's going to be worth it. But if there's if you've barely got enough moisture, it's very hard to grow a cover crop, because they do use your water. So you have to be able to get more or equal amount of water either saved or recaptured than if you didn't grow one.
So and Ray DeBenko brought this up in the comments too, because my mind goes to it's longer term, and I completely understand that, you know, in a year like this one where a crop did not necessarily grow at all in some areas, that's a different scenario. But for those areas that were dry and drought, you know, technically, but still got a crop and maybe got some rain this fall, when I look at that photo of that wind erosion, the cycle of not having a crop there only makes that worse, right? So in my mind, it goes to, can you get something established that will at least hold the soil, which has organic matter, that will keep it where you want it, that will hopefully build the organic matter, that when there is water, the soil holds it. But I understand that's a longer term play, right?
I guess that's well, see, and just to clarify, that photo was taken around in an area where they had tilled the area for whatever reason. And so so the tillage is what caused the problem. So if you're no-till, and if you've got good cover, like if you got the soil armor on the top, I mean, really, if you don't have enough moisture to establish a crop, there's no point in trying to grow anything. If you have some excess moisture, maybe it's worth getting something up that can capture more snow over the winter. But I think as long as you've got a good soil cover, then just hold off and try again the next year, because it's I don't know if we want to get into relay intercropping yet, but that's one of the ideas. And maybe just to briefly comment on it is when you're relay intercropping, you're establishing the cover crop within the existing crop just before it gets really competitive. One of the advantages of that is that the crop will starve out the cover crop if there really isn't enough moisture. But in a year where there is enough moisture, then you've got the cover crop established to keep going. So it could be a good risk management thing if we can, as we can make it work, figure out how to make it work.
Yeah. Now, I will share. So Kara Oosterhuis, who works for Real Agriculture, she's based at Bow Island, very dry area. And with the incredible wind early in 2021, even those fields that were no-tilled were blowing. It was just so incredibly dry, and the wind was just so severe. So sometimes even the best laid plans don't necessarily work out how we'd like. And of course, Peter Johnson would like me to tell everyone to grow winter wheat. But I would like to point out, Peter Johnson, that winter wheat also likes to winter kill in Western Canada. And as Scott has pointed out, if there's no moisture for a crop, there's no moisture for winter wheat either. That being said, I have, in the Red River Valley, I have seen wheat go into completely dry ground in like late October, and it did make a crop the next year. So there you go. Okay, a question for Laura. In tallying up some of these benefits that you've been measuring in your long-term trials, how long? So you said 1 year, annual ryegrass, not necessarily going to see much. How long? What year did you start to see some of these benefits pop up on the stats?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a fair one. So, yeah. So I guess if I want to be a little bit cheeky, I'll say, like, I just didn't have the resources in 2007 to measure everything, right? And even in 2010, like, think about it, when we were talking cover crops, it was kind of, please, can I have some money to measure cover crops, right? So we didn't we got the crop in, we got the cover crop in, we measured yield, we measured how much cover crop growth was there. That was about it. So it was only in 2015 where we had cover crops grown 6 times in 8 years that we started to measure soil health. And that's fair. It was probably a little bit early, but that's when we first started measuring. So how many times does it take? Like, I guess that depends on your soil type and where you're starting from. What's your system? In my system, where we have processing veg plus grains, and we can fit cover crops in there 6 times in 8 years, we could increase organic matter, organic carbon by a pretty decent amount. If we look at the literature, though, there was a meta-analysis that was done, and they said 58% of the medium-term studies showed greater soil organic matter with cover cropping in the medium term. So 58%. But if you went to 10 years in those studies, then 100% of those studies showed long-term cover cropping for 10 years increased soil organic matter. Now, you got to keep in mind that 10 years of cover cropping is only 4 studies in the States. But we're starting, right? We're starting to get more and more data.
Well, and I mean, this is also, that's just it, is that just because there's been a lot of interest doesn't necessarily mean we've had all the studies set up and ready to roll and away we go, right? So there is still so much of this that we're learning. Scott, you mentioned, relay intercropping. We've got super cool trials going on here as well, and farmer directed ones. And so, I mean, so much of this is a learning curve for sure, and trying to navigate what's going to work, what's not. And still, of course, from the farmer's perspective, still trying to pay the bills every year. And as we know, sometimes learning can be expensive, or it's maybe it's missed opportunity more so than high costs, but potentially, right? And yes, Jason reminds me that the fall of 2011 was when, I think it was 2011 into 2012, when it was incredibly dry in the valley, and winter wheat did go into basically dust, and it still managed to make your crop. So yes, Pete, it can happen. Anyway, okay, so Laura, I want to delve into, if we can, you do have a couple slides here, of course, because we can't have this whole conversation about, improvements to soil health and whatever, if we can't get to a yield difference. So Jay's got some slides here. Take us through whichever ones you want. We can skip over whatever, but tell us what we're looking at here in this trial. Beyond your excellent Photoshop skills of you in a cornfield.
Yeah, so we have, all of these photos come from my long-term cover crop experiment. So this is in 2021, and we saw the same thing in 2020. So this year I decided to up my photo game and take I should have put the corn cobs on the back of the pickup on the tailgate, but I didn't have the truck with me. So I did Photoshop this. So the no cover crops is one photo, and I lined that up with me standing in front of the long-term cover crops. So this is same day, like minutes apart, and 2 photos that I lined up. So the no cover crops, they haven't seen cover crops. The long-term cover crops has been in cover crops since 2007. And you could see it in this photo, it's, height, a little bit greener, but even earlier in the season, we saw that there was more nitrogen to that corn crop, We just pulled corn off the field. We're hand harvesting, so we still have to get our yield data in. There's another shot too. I wonder if you can show the picture of the corn. I'm not sure if it'll show up in people's on the screen. So this was in 2020. So same experiment, just side by side. Now the no cover crop is on your left, and somewhat shorter, definitely less green, hurting for nitrogen. So in this picture, we have annual cover crops grown 10 times in 13 years. We only gave the corn starter nitrogen. And so what we think is happening is that with the increase in organic matter, you have that cycling of carbon and nitrogen, and it's timing with release for when the corn needs it. If you're just one-time cover cropping, and we saw that in our earlier experiments, yeah, there could be a nitrogen penalty. Or if you let your rye get too big, you could have a nitrogen penalty. But what we saw was this deficiency. And then if you go to, maybe Lindsay asked for yield. I don't know if we can find that yield.
Jay's pretty good.
Jay will find it. Okay. So
there we go. We just have to flip through. Do we get there?
Yeah, so we can start here, Jay.
Let's look at this one. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is in that same piece of land. And we had the Soil Health Institute. They did a North American-wide study on soil health, and these are their numbers from my plots. And we can see that with radish, you've got a 5% increase in organic matter. Went from 3.4% organic matter on this sandy loam up to 3.9. And so that's consistent with our earlier findings that in this long term, we are seeing increases in soil organic matter.
Now, Jay,
I don't know.
The next one yields, maybe? And then, so we have a couple of people we even have a seconder to a question, which is, I love how democratic we're getting, guys. This is fantastic. Okay, so let's touch on yield, and then we'll move on to some of these questions for sure.
Right. So if you watched the Ontario Ag Conference, I did show some of this data. And so this was in 2020. So in Ridgetown, we were really dry early on. And from like April was dry, May, June. It wasn't until the 10th of July in 2020 that we got decent rainfall. So that water and nitrogen interaction with the organic matter, I think, is what's going on here. And we did see a significant yield boost because, in my mind, of that soil health, nitrogen, water interaction. Now, having said that, with only 30 pounds of starter N to the corn, and you get 187 bushels of corn, that's not bad. So I am on really nice soil that's very forgiving, and the cover crops are adding to it.
Mm-hmm. Now, Peter has, before we move away from the slide, Peter has a follow-up to this. Is that, when you have this laid out, does that mean that was radish as a cover crop 10 times in 13 years?
Yes.
Okay, and so is that realistic?
It is in my system where we've got horticultural, like processing veg.
Yeah.
And then we have some wheat and soy and corn in there as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. All right. So questions. Okay, go ahead, Laura, and then I want to move to the
Yeah,
soil health.
I think that part of realistic, it is a valid comment. Um, I think the one of the reasons why we are seeing this is because we've got a long growing season and we can grow quite a bit of cover crops.
Mhm. Yeah,
And that
absolutely.
definitely. So it's the frequency and the amount of biomass, I think that's important.
Right. And well, and because I mean, as you mentioned with that nitrogen cycle of the nitrogen in the, nitrogen is released, but then yes, nitrogen is tied up and then cycled through, but the healthier that cycle is, right, the more robust it's going to be when conditions are good, right? So, but you have to build it. You have to build that system before you can actually gain the benefits of it, or even rely on it potentially, depending on how much fertilizer goes up this winter. So two questions, and I think they're incredibly good ones, because this is also, from the Real Ag perspective. We get press releases and things that come across our desk all the time, and we're seeing, of course, more and more of these either products or tests to say, here's how you test soil health. So you have, Laura, you've mentioned, some of the things you are measuring, but Scott, if you've got, I'll start with you, Scott. If you've got, clients or whatever who are saying, I want to, validate the work I'm doing, is there a test? Because there are a couple of them out there. Is there one in particular you like, or do you use multi-factors and sort of add it all up, or how do you measure soil health?
I don't go for any of the soil health tests yet. They're first
I think
of
that's
all,
fair.
Okay, so
they're expensive. There's not well, for us there is a local lab, but it has been a slow turnaround when I've talked to them, and any of the other ones you have to send them, somewhere into the U.S. or across wherever it is. From what I have seen, they can give you a number, but you have to be able to compare. So then, they might be valuable if you have 10 years of them, but if you pick the test that doesn't end up being the one that actually works, it's really it's not worth it quite yet, I don't think, until we really figure out which ones are the. And I mean, I guess actually to answer the question of what the best test is really just, is the soil staying in place? Is it taking in water? And are you, is it taking in, like for irrigation, can you irrigate it and the water all infiltrates, or does it run off? Or in dry land, if a storm comes, does it all go in? And if you're starting to see that good aggregation, if you can see that, then I think that's your best test of it right now. And until there's a good proven one, or if we get to carbon markets and they say this is the test you use, then that's what we use. But until then, no, I don't think there's a good one yet.
All right, and Laura, you're nodding, so
yeah, I would agree. Yeah, definitely. And is it crusting? Is your soil crusting? I would suggest let's soil test. Let's just take a 15 centimeter depth, measure organic matter, your CEC, your pH, your P and K. Let's start there and add to what Scott said, and you'll be miles ahead. The only other thing I would add is, nothing. You said it, Scott. You got it.
But this is a really good point, right? Is that we have existing tests that are accurate, that we have a history of, that measure several different things. So as you mentioned, CEC, pH, nutrient levels, we already have that, and on many farms have a history of those those factors that we can go back and compare.
Yep.
Although this is the shout out for soil testing, because we had on one of these agronomists not that long ago, we talked about soil testing, and then off air we talked about how the trend of soil testing has hardly changed as to how
Yes.
many fields get tested per year. Over 20 years, we're hardly testing any more fields than we used to. That
Yes.
just blows my mind. So, square one, we can use a good soil test and one that's reliable. But then I love this integration of this is where the human factor comes in and the observations you can make about that soil that are, yes, somewhat qualitative. They're not quite as subjective, but I think we can all agree on yes, water is infiltrating, or no, water is not. So as much as maybe it's not super precise, it still is a pretty solid discussion to have, right?
Yeah, that observation is huge, Lindsay. And as a scientist, I want numbers. Like, and I really enjoy working with those numbers, but it's no substitute for less ponding. So a grower in Michigan that I know who's been no-till and cover cropping for decades, he says, I'm pulling bigger equipment with the same horsepower because the soil's friable and workable. And then he's like, yeah, and in 2012 when they were dry in Michigan, he's like, I still pulled off 60 bushel beans. So that's the measure in my mind of your soil health. Now, when I say dry, that's not relative to Scott. I apologize because
it's not Alberta and Saskatchewan dry. Okay, now, but that does actually, there's a great comment here about, and this sort of ties into Pete's throwback video of, this roots not iron. It was, the big mantra for a while. And we have learned, because of course for a long time it was, we just need residue. We need residue, we need residue. And yes, residue is a wonderful thing, but we've evolved and learned about the importance of a living root system as long as possible during the growing season. So now, Scott, you're in the West. It is a different system. We have a pretty short growing season. I hate to say it, but it usually starts and ends rather abruptly. And so, whereas I have come to love our long falls in Ontario, I won't lie, though I miss the prairies. But anyway, so the question is basically, what's an acceptable amount of time to not have living roots? Like, assuming you've got the moisture, okay? So from a soil biology perspective, is there sort of a time where it's like, yeah, you're okay? Or what is the detriment? So the opposite, I guess, of that is, what is the detriment to not having living roots in that system? Which is sort of where we're at for much of Western Canada.
I think like there's a worry that if you don't have roots, then your microbes are all going to die, but that's not the case. Like, it's obviously better if you can have some roots. So I mean, in our perspective, if we had enough moisture that we were actually having it go deeper than our roots could go, then yeah, maybe you're losing some potential. But we probably haven't recharged our root zone for years here. And so if you, like anybody who's on dry land this year, if you can, the best thing is to try to just get as much moisture into the soil as possible. And like, nutrient leaching is not a big concern for us. I've just got some soil samples back this year, and it's all irrigated. And there's so that even under irrigation, the heat this year really hurt the crops. And so there's some nitrogen left over, but it's in that 6 to 12 or 6 to 24 inch layer. So even under irrigation, even where we were giving them 15 to 20 inches of water, we didn't lose. We didn't, because we could barely keep the top 2 feet moist. So I guess like soil biology, yeah. Like, I mean, if you're leaving it fallow for a whole year, yeah, maybe you're going to hurt things a little bit. But even just say for a perspective of our prairie land here, there was some of the grassland that never really greened up this entire year. It greened up just a little bit, but it never got above last year's growth. And I know areas that it browned off and it never greened up this fall.
Mm-hmm.
But those systems will, if whenever we get, whether it's this year or next year or a few years, when they get the moisture again, they'll keep going again. They, the microbes know how to survive
Adapt.
these events.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And they do go dormant, right? There is a dormancy.
Go dormant. Yep.
For soil biology.
Yep.
Yeah.
They know how to. They know how to figure out how to survive in extreme conditions for years. So they'll figure it out.
They're like little aliens, Laura. So now from a different perspective as well, but similar. I mean, we sort of have the opposite problem in Ontario. We have a crop that can come off in August sometimes, and nothing is intentionally put back on there. It's left. So obviously things do start to regrow, and there might be winter wheat regrowth or weed regrowth or whatever. But we've talked about this a few times, but Laura, I'd love to get your perspective. If I take winter wheat off, do I need, if let's say I didn't put red clover in, so I don't have that clover coming, but I've got winter wheat regrowth coming or whatever, is that enough? Is that good enough? Does it do any benefit whatsoever? Or do I really need to be intentional in what's growing there after the winter wheat comes off?
I would say yes. I am biased, right? Because I do a lot of cover crop research, and we have measured how much volunteer wheat cover crop, and it doesn't compare to your planted cover crop. Does it serve a purpose? Yes. Is that better than tilling it all up and then taking out the weeds again and till it again? Definitely. But the value of planting a cover crop, whether you just broadcast or seed it, it's there.
Mm-hmm. That also happens, the whole tilling and then tilling again. And then, so I'm just saying, you could just let it grow.
Right. Well, and don't forget how fun it is to watch something grow, right? Think about that field. Like if it's just wheat or weeds, you're going to be looking at that field going, oh man, I got to take after that, right? But if it's a cover crop, then it's like, wow, look at what's growing. Look at how much growth there is. Mm-hmm. And it can be fun.
Yeah. Okay, so a little shout out for our farm. We have a neighbor who wanted to do a cover crop grazing trial, and so he put in radish, buckwheat, oats, and something else. And of course, we just had a frost, so the buckwheat is now smushed, and it's done. But totally to your point, he was sending pictures like every 3 days. Look what's growing. Look how big this is. Like it was a whole other, because this is the first time growing something after winter wheat. And so we put the sheep in last Monday, and it was a good like 10, 12 inches tall, and there's lots of different species there, and it's really cool. And we're just rotating them around the 26 acres, so they're not going to scalp it. They're leaving some behind. So
perfect.
And it's super neat to watch. And so we will have to, of course, take some measurements for both of you and let you know how it goes.
Just send some photos.
Yeah, exactly. I'll send you. I can at least do that at the very least. Yeah, absolutely. Some great comments in the comments here. Some great comments about soil microbes, of course, because this is the big unknown that we're all trying to navigate, right? This is a fully biological system that we, of course, are part of. We're adding plants into, we're taking nutrients out of, but we're trying to figure out what's best for our soil, and that really is what's best for our soil microbes. So, Scott, you had a really neat perspective in the Pulse School that you did recently about you don't have to cover crop the whole field, that you can do this in sections or in parts. Walk me through that process. What is that? What might that look like in your neck of the woods?
Yeah. So I mean, I think even it showed a little bit in that that video of Peter's. It kind of looked like it was just the hilltop was done, and I mean that's where and maybe even so I guess in terms of wind erosion, if it's mainly going to be the sandy hills that you're concerned of, then put the effort into there. But maybe you don't have to worry about every every part of the field, or perhaps if your hills every year are not growing well, you're not getting much out of them, and then they're blowing or being eroded away by water. Take a year and really build up that cover there in it, or maybe even maybe you use cereal rye and maybe you let it go a little longer than you normally would, and you don't get as good a crop one year, but you finally get that cover on it that's going to hold it in place. So, and there could be, I'm trying to think of an example, but, in the variable rate or the variable application sphere, there could, instead of putting, say, a 5 species or an 8 species mix across the entire field, maybe there's a case for having 3 species and, having a map where you plant them in the certain areas where you need it the most. So, you don't necessarily have to be all in, or, you don't have to think that you have to do, it either has to be everything or nothing.
Yeah. And that, I think that's one of the key things, and some great comments coming in as well, even asking if we even need multi-species at all. And also, if you've seen with the soil network here in Ontario, there's definitely some that are going into like 60-inch wide corn rows and then rows of cover crops in between. So we've got some really cool experiments going on to try and figure out what can we gain, and what, how much work does it take and all that sort of stuff. This is a good question, though, that I do want to ask, because I don't think it's been asked already, but how much top growth is needed in the fall before a frost to be confident that the cover crop has actually done some good? And that is vague enough to say, all right, so how much is that some good? So Laura, I'll start with you. How much growth do I need before a frost or before winter? Whichever comes first, I guess.
Yeah, I guess some benefit. So I really learned a valuable experience when I had a longtime cover cropper. He was like, "Oh yeah, go look at that cereal rye that we planted after corn harvest." And so like drive down the road and I'm like, where is this? And then finally I stop, and the rye was 3 little leaves, and it was hardly green at all. But that person was gonna graze it in the spring, right? So for that farmer, at least having something green, it'll overwinter. The next spring they can graze it off, and then that gives extra to the cows, right? So how much do you need as a benefit? I guess it depends on your system. We have done studies where we planted cover crops a month apart, and in the end it didn't make a difference in terms of yield, whether you planted it in early August or early September. And keep in mind, I'm in Ridgetown, so we do get a decent amount of growth.
Yeah, it's basically Florida for anyone following along at home. Yeah.
But we did, there was difference between the no cover and the cover crop in terms of yield, corn and snap beans. But didn't really matter if you had lots of growth or not a lot of growth in that short term. So I think that really points to the below ground and circles back to what we were talking about in terms of microbes, right? It's about capturing carbon through photosynthesis, and that's the energy source for those microbes. And without energy, well, I'm not doing very well, and neither, right? Those microbes are,
yeah. And I mean, Scott, for the West as well, I mean, realistically, it's about, depending on what your goal is, but so long as you can get that crop to establish. And then, of course, then there's the issue with stuff that that you wanted it to die and it didn't. But let's tackle with the, do you have enough by freeze up? Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing, is that in terms of erosion control, I've seen winter wheat in February that was only, I don't know, like say 3 inches or 4 inches, and there was even still space between the rows, like 6-inch rows, and that was enough to hold soil in place when other areas were blowing. But in terms of benefits, I know so maybe in terms of nutrient scavenging, if you've got a big, like in that one with Peter, like that roots where they were, I don't know, like, there was a pretty good root growth under there. That's probably its job. But it hasn't scavenged all those really, really deep nutrients. Like it's getting more of the surface layer ones. I do know in potato production, when they look at using mustards as a biofumigant, they say it's all about biomass. Like you can't just put a mustard in after winter wheat in our area. They're talking like you need it at least 6 feet tall. In our area, you need to take a whole year out. You need to chop it, disc it in, and do the work. And in terms of weed suppression in the no-till organic, they talk about it's biomass. You've got to have that. If you don't have the biomass, it's not going to suppress the weeds. So again, it comes down to your goals. You've really got to know what your goals are. So.
And I'm just going to put a plug in. Some is better than none. That's my plug.
As long as you don't spend too much money on it, because if you spend $50 an acre on a cocktail mix, and you get 2 or 3 inches of growth, maybe you didn't quite get your money's worth out of that. So
exactly. Well, but also, what was your goal, right? And so, I mean, Laura, as you pointed out, for someone who's just looking for early grazing, they're not looking for a standout, winter growth or fall growth or whatever. That's a different goal. And then of course, with our mild winter last year, there were several farmers that of course put their mix together with the plan. And of course, some farmers are trying bio strip tillage. So they're planting things that are supposed to die over winter, to avoid having to spray them. And then they didn't die. So that adds a whole other, Have you had that happen, Laura?
Exact bio strip, radish didn't kill it.
So then what did you have to spray it out, or did you till it out?
We did.
Sprayed it out.
Yeah.
It's a lot of spring is busy, and if you weren't planning on that pass, that could really throw a wrench in things, especially if it's wet. Anyway, I am hopeful that Western Canada gets the wet spring and we get a lovely dry one like we had this past year. So that's my order I'm putting in now. Right. John said some is better than none. He says a little bit is better than nothing. Sounds like there's some relationship advice here. Anyway, everyone, there you go. Everyone be kind. This has been, so I promised that this would go by quickly. I also did not get to most of my clips, and this seems to be a new trend. So I apologize to everyone who was waiting for them. Although I will say, if people want to see more clips, do let me know. If you're okay with fewer, that's fine too. I did want to send a shout out, Jay, we don't have to necessarily play it, but NDSU Extension, so Abby Wick out of North Dakota, had a great post this week on Twitter, so do go check her out, showing the advancements in cover cropping, yes, even in North Dakota, so very similar to Manitoba growing conditions, so plenty of acres that did get in this fall in that area and are growing lovely right now and are sort of doing what they want them to do and keeping soil where it should be, because of course that area does get quite a bit of that wind erosion as well. So it's very cool. I highly recommend everyone go and check it out, because we definitely get here at Real Agriculture, we get plenty of, and I 100% hear you. When it's too dry, nothing's going to grow. But when we think about these cycles of trying to build organic matter, trying to keep our soil in place, we need something there. And so cover crops may play a role in that for sure. Anyway, it was suggested, but harder to make cover crops work with shorter seasons. Absolutely, Peter Johnson. There's only so many days in the growing season, and so there's only so much we can do for sure. So Laura, And to Scott, thank you both so much for joining me here on The Agronomist. This was great. Thank you for sharing your time and your expertise. Shout out to everyone in the comments as well. Lovely to see so many of you. And thank you so much for so many fantastic comments and questions. This has been fantastic and a lot of fun. As always, of course, yes, please head over to realagriculture.com/agronomist to get your CEU credits. And tomorrow is, so Tuesday, October 26th, 10 a.m. Eastern, live stream tomorrow. Ontario Diagnostic Days, the last day, goes tomorrow. So if you're in Ontario, and even if you're not, hop on here at 10 Eastern. Dr. Dave Hooker is going to be on. Sean Haney is hosting. Dr. Francois Tardif, I think, is on as well. Maybe even Albert Tenuta. Who knows? There's going to be a whole bunch. Laura, I think you're off the hook on that one, though. Yours were all
Yes.
pre-recorded. So you don't have to do this 2 days in a row. So there you go.
No.
All right, Laura, thanks so much. Scott, and cheers, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.